everyone, and happy Wednesday. Guys, what's going on in the world is kind of crazy, but you already know that. So I'm not going to dive into how we are moving, over the cliff in the United States, but there are certain things that I want to discuss today. Mostly it concerns foreign policy and how we react to it. And I thought there would be no better guest than Scott Horton for this, because he has done some amazing work about the US and its foreign policy. So I wanted to talk to him for a very long time. He joins me today. Scott, thank you so much for joining and taking time this morning. I know that you've been working on multiple different things. You have written 5 books or four different books?
Well, I wrote 3, and the other 2 are collections of interviews that I've done. One of them is with all interviews of Dr. Ron Paul, and then the other one is all experts about all different facets of nuclear weapons around the world and so forth. Then the books that I wrote, one is Fool's Errand about Afghanistan, Enough Already about the entire terror wars, and then the latest is called Provoked, how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine.
Amazing. And we will touch on that because this is seems to be one of the most important conflicts ongoing right now in the world. Let's start with what is going on with Russia and Trump. I mean, feels to me that Trump is like, one day he's very pro-peace, next day he wants to hurt Russia, then he changes his mind. We had a president before like him, wherever, someone would convince him with a better argument that this is what's going on, Mr. President, his mind would just change according to the last person he spoke to. So what is your opinion about that? What's up with Trump today?
Well, look, I think that probably is part of it. He doesn't have a lot of background knowledge about any of these things. And so he overestimates, the role of his own very large personality to be able to affect change when, the circumstances in which he finds himself in the middle are just really not that conducive to, his will. So it's a stupid way to say it, but point is, essentially, it's really just a tragedy that Trump got inaugurated for his second term at just the wrong, stupid time. He very sincerely wanted to end the war. He wants to end the war. He talks about it all the time and is obviously sincere about that. But the problem is, at the time that he was inaugurated to begin his second term, at the beginning of this year, he finds himself in a situation where over there on the ground in the war in Ukraine, the Russians are winning slowly. So they're not anywhere near their goals yet. They still have a quarter of Donetsk to take and anywhere from a quarter to a third still of Zaporozhye and Kherson still to take. That could be years of fighting still at the current rates anyway. And yet time is on the Russian side and they know that they're winning, and it's a war of attrition, and they're grinding up Ukrainian forces until the point where they finally break, which I don't know if anyone knows when that'll finally be. It's been 3 years and a half of this already, and more, almost 4 years of it. God. And so Trump comes in and says, time out, everyone stop fighting. But the Ukrainians, they don't want to turn around and walk away from the territory that they still control. Why? Just because Trump demands it? They don't want to do that. And then the Russians aren't going to settle for less than they've already claimed, and yet, again, have still failed to capture large amounts of this territory. And so, Trump is like, yelling at a rain cloud to go away, but it's just not going to. It's just this situation is on its own course. And there's really, he doesn't have, he can threaten the Russians. He's added new sanctions today, but that's marginal, ineffectual. Biden already tried that. We can pour in more weapons. Biden already tried that. And now he has the carrot of promising full normalization with Russia. But that would have to be one sweet package, because from the point of view of Moscow, they can't trust Washington. Even if Trump makes a really good deal, the next president could override it, when the consensus in Washington is still very anti-Russian. And so whatever normalization would have to include probably bazillion-dollar deals for American companies to develop Russian resources in Siberia, right? And get back in the old nuclear treaties, sign new ones, and invite Putin to Washington, take him out to the ball game, and make a good friend out of him again, and all of that stuff. And that is not going to happen, right? That is the tallest order and is not on the table at all. So Trump is just stuck, right? In other words, he would have to go so far to accommodate the Russians to get what he wants that he can't go that far. And the situation on the ground is one where the Ukrainians don't want to quit yet, and the Russians are still winning and have no reason to stop. And so and it is the damnedest thing, because the fighting should stop now. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and it ought to, quite frankly, it ought to be the highest priority of all of humanity that we just prevent hot wars from breaking out on Russia's borders. We just don't want that. Right. Whatever is going on, send Lavrov and Rubio to Geneva to sit down and hash this thing out somehow. Because, in fact, ultimately, America can't really tell Russia what to do, but they can tell Ukraine what to do. And they can force an accommodation if the highest priority is ceasefire. We could make that happen, but it would mean seriously stabbing our friends, the Ukrainians, in the back after promising them so much and helping to get them into this fight.
Right. And I think the biggest problem here, Scott, that we are facing is very simple. Americans never learned what Russians are. And coming from Georgia, I can tell you that I feel like they never learned the culture and Russian mindset, because keep making the same mistakes over and over again. So here's the situation Vladimir Putin has, okay? And tell me if I'm wrong, because I would like your input on this. So when Soviet Union went down, Russia lost lots of territories, and for really no good reason. I mean, could we agree that before Soviet Union, all these territories, like Georgia was part of Russia, Ukraine was never its own, republic or a country or anything, like it was always part of Russia. Georgia at least had some independence before, and, I would understand why they want independence again after Soviet Union. But the reality is, before Soviet Union, all these territories were part of Russia. And then Soviet Union got even bigger. And when Soviet Union was no more, Russia ended up losing the territories that it originally had over the stupidest deal possible, which is, well, you just promised us that NATO would not advance, and, we'll do what's necessary. Okay, well, that didn't stand. Now, if we put ourselves in Russians' shoes, every single time we were given a promise, whether it's written or verbal, it's not gonna see, a fruition at all. So it's not gonna happen. That's how they approach this. And if we stop now because Trump told us so, first of all, they're not gonna do that. But even if they wanted to honor President Trump, because they still seems to me that Vladimir Putin likes President Trump better than others, and has like some soft spot for him, or at least he plays the game, to show us that he does. The reality is, if he does surrender and end this war, Trump is only in this office 4 years. So next cycle comes in, probably a puppet of intelligence agencies, and Vladimir Putin will find himself exactly where he started, which is arming Ukraine again, trying to conduct a revolution in Georgia. So why the heck would they stop? They have a great chance right now to get the territories they lost over a stupid deal. He has the momentum. Would you stop if you were Vladimir Putin?
Well, yes. If I was him, I would call timeout yesterday.
Really?
Yeah.
Would that be a smart move?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but then again, I'm not the president of Russia. I'm a Texan.
Right.
I think I have a section in my book called Russia's Pyrrhic Victory, about how, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that phrase. It's from an ancient Roman general, Pyrrhus, who I think he was Roman, maybe he was Greek. Anyway, he won a few huge battles, but at a great cost to his own men. And he said, one more victory like this and we're doomed, right? And then, so a Pyrrhic victory is one where, yeah, you get what you wanted, but at such cost that it wasn't really worth it. And I think the Russians are paying and will ultimately pay a very high price for what they've done here. And I think that they painted themselves into an even worse strategic corner than America had already put them in. I'm agreeing on that point. I mean, the book is called Provoked, and it is about how America really put the Russians in this position. But I think that they have helped put themselves in a worse position just to skip, I'll try to address other parts of your question in a moment. But as far as the present day, I mean, just on the face of it, picture the map, right? The Russians just redrew the line in such a way that everyone in Ukraine that ever liked them is now a Russian or will be by the time the war is done, right? Virtually everyone east of the river will be incorporated, or certainly the vast population centers east of the Dnieper River will all be incorporated in the Russian Federation. And then they'll have what's left of Ukraine will be run by hardcore right-wing nationalists, even Nazis from the far west of the country. And in a situation where, remember, the Russian-leaning parties used to win. That was why America had to overthrow the government there twice in 10 years. Now there will be no check, no pro-Russian-leaning anybody, even in the most general sense. Anyone who likes Russia at all will be never part of Ukraine again, or in this era, will be in Russia now. And in fact, right now, one of the most powerful men in the country is a guy named Andriy Beletsky, who is the leader of what they're now called the Third Army Corps, which was known as the Azov Battalion. And this guy is the leader of the Patriot of Ukraine gang, and he's a serious Nazi, and he's made it clear that he has ambitions to rule this country. And now he has competition. General Zaluzny, Valery Zaluzny, is another kind of runner-up to succeed Zelensky, who is not a Nazi. But there are others who, and they have really increased their stature and made themselves so-called heroes fighting this war against Russia. And they are going to be due, and they will inherit a great amount of political power when this thing is over, which is a whole new set of problems for Russia to have to deal with then, not to mention NATO and all the other countries having to deal with the new Ukrainian junta as constituted in the near term here. It's going to be a problem for everyone, including Moscow.
Right. And that was exactly my point, because that's why he shouldn't stop, because we are in this situation.
Well, but see, what I'm saying, I guess,
now would make no sense.
Yeah, but see, the point being, though, like, you're starting in the middle of the story. Once you take the Donbass, then you might as well keep marching all the way to Romania, because you just put yourself in a worse and worse and worse position, right? But it's the original sin there is changing the border. Instead of what he should have done was he should have played much harder hardball to force Europe to actually implement the Minsk II deal as signed and as promised back in 2015. And I believe that he could have found a way to do that short of sending in his troops.
Could you walk me through how? Because we disagree on this like drastically. I think that when Vladimir Putin did try to, approach this diplomatically, it never happened for him. It was always unsuccessful. That's why I'm saying, like, I can't wait to hear what your strategy would have been if not for war, because I saw these play out in Georgia. I was actually there when the war happened, right? And I saw how unsuccessful Russia was, even though they tried really everything not to get to this point. And Georgian government was run by the CIA puppet, and he was just tuning everything out. I mean, he lied to his own citizens. Georgians had no idea that people were dying at the borders for at least 2 days in. And that was only 5-day conflict, really. So people were having concerts and, fireworks and stuff. They had no idea what was going on. This is what he did in Georgia. And then they sent the same guy to Ukraine in Odessa to run as a governor. So if I was Russian, elite, like staff member or even Putin or somebody from the government, I'm looking at this thing and it's like they are surrounding me on all fronts. The one thing that I cannot lose and cannot afford to lose is my own kind in Ukraine. I don't care about Georgia. I'll give them the Georgia with their Saakashvili, whatever. They don't even speak my language, but I'm not going to lose Ukraine because then I'm losing everything. So there's a time when like nice words and diplomacy don't work. And that's where we bring in the guns. And I know people don't like that because that means lots of death and, blood and all that. But I mean, how else? For 14 years, the guy was talking. I know that I grew up watching him talk and no one cared. CIA and FSB, they are not even comparable. What damage can FSB do? Multiplied 100 times more, that's what CIA can do. So when people say like, well, they could have done like, they could have gotten intelligence agencies at work. No, they can't, because you're up against not just CIA, because you're up against MI6, Mossad, CIA, German intelligence. All these people are working together against one country. How are you going to be successful diplomatically when you've got not half, but, entire Western hemisphere against you? Like, what would be your solution here?
Well, look, just on the face of it, the fact that it had been 7 years meant that it could have been 8. There was no real emergency. Right. There was no, when the people of the Far East of the country voted for independence, and then the leaders demanded to be brought into the Russian Federation in 2014, Putin told them no, and demanded that they stop flying the Russian flag. Said, look, we'll help you to fight your civil war and hold Kiev at bay. And that's it. When Angela Merkel came to town in November and said, we have to dial this thing back. First of all, she made Obama agree. Okay, fine. She went to Minsk and she signed a deal with Putin that did succeed in ending all airstrikes, in all the heavy artillery, in armored divisions or infantry divisions making any major offensives. That's far from perfect, but, I think, 9,000 people died the first year. And then, I'm sorry, I think it was another 5,000 or it was another 7,000 people died over the next 7 years, right? So the war was dialed way, way down from what it had been for the first part of it. Now, the Minsk II deal that was passed in February of 2015, which was an improved upon, Minsk I deal, that was never fully implemented. However, Putin did spend 7 years trying to get it implemented. And so did Angela Merkel of Germany. And why? Because they didn't want this. Putin desperately wanted to avoid doing exactly what he ended up doing anyway. And I'm saying he was right the first time. And I quote him in my book, where I think you'll really like the book. I make a lot of your very same points, okay? But I quote him in the book saying, I think they're trying to trap me into this. They're trying to make me do it. But of course, I might have to. They might force me, like quite literally might leave me no choice but to do it. But he could see that this is going to be incredibly costly for Russia. And not just in terms of financially and in terms of dead boys, but also in terms of, like I'm saying, creating a whole new strategic balance in Far Eastern Europe here, where now they're going to have to compensate for that. I'm a libertarian, which means I'm completely free market capitalist and anti-government in basically everything. And in my understanding, anytime government intervenes in the economy, it's bad and wrong, and they screw up something. Then they'll make a new government program to try to fix that problem. Then they'll make a new government program to try to fix the problems that that program caused. But it's all their fault in the first place, right? Like they print money all day, so now they need cheap labor because of the upward pressure on wages. So they bring in a bunch of illegal immigrants, and then they cause a bunch of crime. So now you need a police state over the, right? When what you should have done was not printed the money. Same kind of thing here. Once Putin removes all the people who like him out of Ukraine and makes them full Russians, now he has only enemies left in Ukraine, meaning he has an enemy Ukraine like permanently, which means, and here's what the Russians never wanted to do. I guarantee there's hardly anyone in power in Moscow wants to march all the way to the Carpathian Mountains, wants to march all the way to Moldova and Romania and Poland. They don't want that. This whole problem was they had NATO on their borders. So what I'm saying is, if they just take the east of the country, now they have a Nazi Western Ukraine, which now if they have to bite off all of Western Ukraine too, you're talking a massive expense. You're talking about years of war. You're talking about maybe more than they can manage to do. And so you see what I'm saying is they painted themselves in this corner by crossing this line. Putin was right to refrain. Right. Now, to address your point though, yeah, but he had been trying to negotiate this whole time and the war was still going on, right? America was still threatening to bring Ukraine into NATO, especially the civil war was still going on in the East. But let me take you back to December of 2021. First of all, he started building up in November. And they knew, whoa, that's an invasion force. In December, he said, here's my treaty, sign it. And it ended the war and it made permanent neutrality for Ukraine, rewrite the Constitution for permanent neutrality, and America and NATO forswear NATO membership for Ukraine permanently as well, and all of that. It was basically reasonable, and it could have been negotiated. And I will grant you completely, I make the case in the book, that the Biden government refused to negotiate in good faith. The Biden regime's policy was, you better not. That was plan A, was you better not. But plan B was, if they do it, we're going to make it really hard for them. We're going to bog them down like Ronald Reagan did with Rambo 3 in Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s, like the Taliban just did to us in Afghanistan in the 2000s and teens here. And we're going to inflict on them, as they called it, a strategic defeat. So they were not really willing to negotiate in good faith. However, I still think that there were major flaws in Putin's and Lavrov's diplomacy at that point. We're talking December 21, January and February of 22, right before the war got so much worse. And here's my thing. I think there were things that Putin could have tried. And I'm borrowing one or two of these. I always forget who came up with which ones. And so forgive me. Aaron Mate came up with one or two of these. But one thing he could have done was he could have said, I am shutting down the United Nations Security Council. I will veto everything. And the UN Security Council's business is over and done until I get what I want. Nothing moves on the UNSC until I get peacekeepers. And that is, he chooses from which third country to bring in army troops with baby blue helmets to stand on the demarcation line in that gray zone in the civil war between the so-called rebel forces and Kiev's forces to enforce that peace, to end that war by putting whoever, the South Koreans or whoever you want that has no dog in the hunt, and put them on that line there. And now he did demand that in 2018, but it was at the height of Russiagate, and it just barely got any attention, and they killed it in the UNSC. But he could have pounded his fist on the table and said, I mean it, right? He also could have shut off the gas to Germany and Poland right then and there in the winter, in November and December and January of 21 and 22, and said to them loud and clear, are you cold? Do you hear me now? I am not playing. When I said, here's my treaty, I meant sign the goddamn treaty, right? He didn't do that. Instead, he went, oh, when? No, I'm being coy, right? He was like playing cutesy. They said he's going to invade. He said, I'm not going to invade. Well, why'd you build up all your forces? And, well, I'm just threatening you, but I'm not going to do anything. When what he should have said was, yes, I'm going to invade. That's why I built up my forces. You guys are going to die if you don't do what I say. And instead, he went and denied it for months and right leading up to the invasion. And that was essentially, if you just think about, diplomatically, that was refusing to play his major card, which was the absolute serious and direct threat of violent force. That, dude, if you guys thought I was playing, you're wrong. And if you remember, I'm sure you remember, you're paying close attention at the time. Zelensky came out and said, I think he's bluffing. I don't think he means it. And some of the Americans said, we're not sure if he's going to do it or not. And there was a mixed message going on there. He should have made himself very clear, and he should have made his demands very simple in a way that he allowed it to be overly complicated. And again, the book is called Provoked. And it's about how Washington caused virtually all this to happen. As I say, I put 49% on Biden and 51% on Putin. He's still the George W. Bush in this situation, who pulled the trigger and sent his forces in when he did not absolutely have to do it. So you're right. There are many arguments about why he may have felt he needed to, but that to me is not good enough. And under, basic Christian just war theory, that is not good enough. He could have played much harder hardball in the lead up to the war, and I believe it could have been prevented.
I would say I agree with the guest situation. I completely disagree with the other two, because this brings me back to what I just said when we started this episode. Americans never knew what Russian mindset was, and that's what's causing the problems. Because I agree with
that's
Putin,
basically my point, is he wasn't being clear enough. He should have been clearer.
Yeah. So,
about it all.
and he shouldn't be, because let me tell you something, and then, because we agree on most things, we just disagree on how this whole thing happened and whether the war was the answer, right? As soon as Vladimir Putin could have gotten, like, super, like, feast heavy with UN, they would have kicked him out and said, you're just Russia, you're nobody, you're not going to be included in these things anymore. So that would not pass at all.
I don't
so
think that's true.
I wouldn't.
No, ma'am, no. It's not so easy to just kick Russia off the United Nations Security Council. Just because
It was very easy for Russians to wake up one day and couldn't even use their cards. That's how easy it was for the West to literally. I had
that's
phone
not the
calls
same thing at all.
with friends
No,
in
I'm
Russia.
sorry. Kicking Russia off of the United Nations Security Council is not the same thing as any of these other things. It's just not. And I don't think they would have done that. In December of 21, they couldn't have done it. The French and the Germans would have screamed bloody murder before they let it go that far. Kicking them off the UNSC, I don't believe so. And I don't think they played those cards
I don't know,
as they should
because
have.
I watched things that made no sense to me when it got to. I mean, these people went as far as banning, like, books from literature of Russian writers. I mean, and they wouldn't have done that. I don't know. We could disagree or
Those are
agree,
just
or
totally
agree
different
to disagree on
concepts,
that. Another thing that I want to say is, you never tell, any warrior can tell you this, and I know many Navy SEALs and Green Berets and Delta Force, that you never telegraph your moves. So
that's not true.
yes,
Look at Iraq War I. Look at Iraq War II. Do what we say, or else we're going to invade you, and then we invade. Sometimes it's absolutely the right thing to do. Especially if you have an ultimatum and you really, really mean it, then why be coy about an ultimatum? It makes no sense.
Why would he telegraph his move that he will invade so that Ukraine and NATO forces are ready for him?
They already knew that anyway.
That.
Like, they could see.
You just said they didn't. You just said that they had like 50-50. They couldn't decide what he was going to do, and that's typical Putin.
Here's my point. What I'm saying they knew is that he had all of his forces lined up on the border, ready to go.
Yes, we know.
They knew that much. They were debating, what exactly does this mean? Is he just trying to intimidate us, or does he really mean to do it? And I'm saying that's his fault that they were confused. He should have
agreed. I agree.
Don't understand you. If people don't understand you, it's unless they are just aggressively misunderstanding you. It might be because you haven't communicated clearly enough exactly what you mean to do. And what I'm saying was,
my argument
Putin's
is,
intention was that, and saying, well, I might invade and I might not, which was not conducive to achieving his goal of getting them to give in without having to invade.
I would have done the same, because you never tell your enemy you're coming. It's just idiotic. Like what happened with Iran. Hey guys, why don't you move away? We're going to bomb you. Like, what are you doing? So if you're going to bomb somebody, bomb them. They did it because they didn't want to escalate, okay? So that was not the situation with Putin. Putin wanted to escalate. He had enough and he wanted to invade, but he didn't want to invade stupidly. He wanted to invade without giving this, messages out there. Hey guys, I'm coming. Why don't you get ready so you can kill more of my guys?
Look, I wrote in the book. I wrote in my book. I said, well, perhaps his generals wanted this level of secrecy, and so military necessity required diplomatic incompetence. Because what you're saying is that these generals and their will to preserve X number of infantry on invasion day 1 necessitates Putin and Lavrov not doing the best they can to get what they want without having to have a war at all, which is something that I believe they could have accomplished if they had played their cards right.
Okay, so I understand your point. We just disagree on that, because I think in their heads there was no way left. Maybe in yours, like you think that there was, but obviously they thought there was no way left. Another thing that I think everyone underestimates is Putin himself. So many people ask, like, why now? Why did he do it now? Yes, for years he started, what was it, 7 years ago, he started warning people, and for 7 years he was unsuccessful. Great. So I honestly think, I have a theory on this. He believes that if something like that is going to happen in Russia, it better happen under his leadership. So, and I agree, because if you look at Russia right now, who is going to inherit that post?
But see, you're admitting that he didn't have to do it. You're admitting that there was no emergency that required him to go right then.
I'm telling you. No, it's not about admission. I'm telling you what was the smarter strategy.
But you're admitting it. You're admitting my last point in your construction of this question. You're saying this is like a matter of legacy to get this taken care of before he was gone. I mean, think about what you're saying. That's like W. Bush.
Maybe I'm not clear in what I'm saying. I'm saying that in Putin's mindset, no one could have done this other than him more efficiently. So if Russia had to fight a war with Ukraine, like Russia fought a war with Georgia before 5 days, if he was not in the leadership, he didn't have any trust that someone else would have done a better work.
Well,
that's why he did it. What was that?
Medvedev was in charge during Georgia.
Yeah, and you saw how that went for Russians.
Yeah, they won in 2 weeks.
That was not successful for Russians at all.
And they won in a week and a half?
No, it was 5 days, and Russia had serious problems with the Rocky Tunnel and all of that. So I can go forever on that war because I was actually present there, and I know exactly what was going on. But Russia did not perform in that war as Russia should have performed. You're fighting about 3 million people. Georgia is like this tiny.
Okay, but what you're doing, so take your entire case for war and now add to it, and Putin had to do it because if he waited until someday when some other president was in charge, they wouldn't do a good enough job. You are conceding there that there was no emergency on February 22nd, 2022 that was any different than February 20th or 18th. He did not have to go. And why did he wait so long? He waited so long because he thought he was doing everything he could to try to build what they called the Eurasian home with Germany. He was trying to move west. He was trying to suck up. This is why
I agree with that. We don't disagree on that.
This is why Boris Yeltsin did not invade the Donbass in Novorossiya in 1991, because he said, even though this should go back to Russia, oh, well, screw it. We're trying to suck up to the West right now. We have more important priorities. Befriending Germany, befriending Russia, and the United States, and moving west. And so,
you really believe that there is such a thing as befriending the United States? Should I remind you of what Henry Kissinger said?
I believe.
It's very dangerous to be an enemy of the United States, but it's deadly to be the friend of the United States.
Yeah, but what was Kissinger talking about? Kissinger was talking about a situation like supporting Ukraine against a larger enemy that eventually will crush them. That was what he was talking about, propping people up against larger enemies that will eventually, and then betraying them. That was he wasn't talking about major powers like getting along with, say, England or Japan or Russia. He wasn't saying, Japan, look out, we're going to betray you. He wasn't saying that. He was saying people like the Ukrainians should not trust us when we promise them we'll help them fight a larger enemy that will surely destroy them. Like when we support the Kurds against Iraq, or when we support the Hmong tribesmen against the Vietnamese, and then they end up getting left hung high and dry. That's what he was talking about there. And by the way, listen, as Joe Biden himself said, no Russian president since Peter the Great has thrown in with the West as much as Vladimir Putin. He has tried and tried and tried and continues to try to get along with the West. There are, and I'm not the greatest expert on internal politics in Moscow, but I know that there are revisionists who would much rather just go east. And Putin argues, the strong man, authoritarian president, has held down this position and has argued his whole presidency long that no, we are a Christian nation. We are part of the West, even if the eastern frontier of the West. We are not an Asian civilization. He told Madeleine Albright, I like eating with chopsticks, but let's get real. We are part of European Christendom, and we need to and must belong to Europe with you. He calls America, even when we're supporting Chechen suicide bombers killing school children, he says, I really wish our American partners would behave more responsibly, because he's trying to do everything he can to stay with us. Remember when they overthrew the government in 2014? Remember they bragged that they were going to get away with it because he's distracted by the Sochi Olympics. But why was he doing the Sochi Olympics? He spent $14 billion on the Sochi Olympics. Why? Because he's trying to impress me. He's trying to impress the United States of America and say, see, I'm like you, you're like me. So do I think that he's wise to trust like personal friendships with power players in Washington? No. But is that the smart policy? Has that been the wise policy for him to attempt to pursue this whole time? Friendship with Bush, friendship with Obama, friendship with Trump. Obviously, it was never on offer with Joe Biden, but he has tried to pursue reset after reset after reset. And God bless him for that. It's the only thing that's kept the peace. It ain't the American side that's kept the peace. It's his unreasonable reasonableness in willing to, put up with the amount of the Americans shovel that has kept the peace this whole time. And I don't want him changing his mind about that. I prefer that he consider Ukraine to be a minor emergency in his overall relationship with the western half of this planet, because we got to live on this world together and we have an indefinite future coming. And so we cannot be enemies. We cannot go back to the real Cold War like it was before.
You seem like you're asking, it seems like you're asking a lot from him, but less from our leaders. So well, that's the thing. Like,
I'm just saying what I'm doing is
it's like Vladimir Putin, why don't you suck it up forever while we don't do anything in the US to change our government? I know it's not how you think, Scott. You're actually very strategic, very good at what you do. So I know your thought is, no, we got to fix it in the US too. But just imagine for a second being the guy himself. Like, what we are asking him to do is suck it up forever. He's not going to do that. Right. He's just not going to do that, because then you're making him a doormat, and Vladimir Putin will do anything and everything not to be that, including war. So that's why I'm saying I understand why he's doing what he's doing. And now there's no time to stop, because if he stops, he's going to end up in the worst case, like possible, So the only way he can stop is if we completely abandon Project Ukraine and possibly Project Georgia. Do you agree with that? Like, if he stops, we probably have to completely abandon Project Ukraine.
Yes. Look, his demands for a final peace deal from Ukraine here are going to be incredibly steep, and he's going to get what he wants. As I've said all along, the Russians are going to win this war, and I'm very grateful. It doesn't seem to me like it's in very great danger of spreading into a general war between NATO and Russia, although that is still a danger. But I think ultimately they are going to win this war in Ukraine, and they'll write the Constitution to say what they want it to say, including permanent neutrality. They'll probably force the Americans and the Europeans to agree to never, and maybe even sign a new treaty eventually, promising never to bring them into NATO, closing the so-called open door, which is just nonsense. Part of what started this war is that ridiculous policy. And the Americans in the West will climb down. As far as Putin sucking it up, I guess I'm not calling for that. It's not that I'm demanding that of him. It's that I'm celebrating that about him, that apparently, as I've often said, essentially the guy is sociopath enough that he doesn't really have feelings. And so in places where you might expect he would get really angry and do something angrily, he doesn't. He just says, boy, our American partners sure are acting rash this week. And then he goes right on ahead, helping us launch our astronauts up to the International Space Station, or goes right on ahead with joint maritime exercises in the Pacific, or whatever it is. I don't know if they're doing those anymore, but whatever it is that it still has ongoing partnerships, some counterterrorism stuff, some counter drug stuff, obviously the space missions. We got Russian rockets with Ukrainian motors putting Americans in space. Like, can't we all get along? And I really appreciate that about him, that he doesn't just stomp his foot and turn away. He does keep the doors open. And I think he knows that he has someone sincere in Donald Trump who agrees with him that, yes, Russia is part of European civilization and must stay that way. And quite frankly, Trump's thinking there is, we want to peel Russia away from China because we want to lord it over China. The same way we helped peel China away from the Soviet Union in the 1970s, we want to do the same thing here. Now, in fact, a lot of the anti-Russian hawks, their concern is China too. But instead of trying to befriend Russia, they figure they just want to bog Russia down in Europe to make them less useful to China. Although I think that has really backfired. I mean, look whose policy it was. Joe Biden. the senile, absolute idiot. So what did he do? He just kicked Russia's economy further toward China when, as we all know, Russia is a resource exporter and China's importing all those resources and making things out of them. How in the hell is that weakening China? You know, that's absolutely insane when Russia is a giant stack of timber and gas and oil, right? And all the minerals that you need to do everything you want. So I think Putin knows that he has at least a potential willing partner in Trump. But then again, where we started this conversation, Trump just got sworn in at the wrong time to solve this particular conflict. Unless the Russians send in an extra 400,000 men and just march to the river in one big fell swoop, which they're not doing, that is clearly not their strategy at all to do, then this isn't going to end soon. And the Russians aren't willing to pull the brake. So it's very pessimistic. And I do think that the threat of the spread of war remains. Remember, you know, they're talking about these Tomahawk missiles. A Tomahawk missile can be tipped with an H-bomb. So now we're talking about some, you know, corporal, right? Some captain or lower ranking person sitting at a computer screen in Russia, looking at a Tomahawk missile cruising what looks like toward Moscow. And he and his commanding officers all just have to pray to Jesus and have religious faith that must not be an H-bomb, right, guys? When in fact, when we're at this spirit of heightened tension in the middle of this horrible proxy war right on their border, they might not give us that benefit of the doubt. They might be terrified and assume, oh my God, a nuclear first strike, and think it's an H-bomb. And as we know, because of the tensions of this war, the Russians have loosened their previous nuclear posture to closer to America's launch on warning posture. It's still a little bit tighter than ours, but it's looser than it was before. And there have been many times, I'm sure you and your audience know, there have been many times, well, at least two major times where you literally had real rockets flying that Russian military satellites and sensors and computers mistakenly identified as incoming atom bombs or hydrogen bombs. And it was lower level military officers who said, nah, I don't buy it. Why would Bill Clinton nuke us now? With just 3 missiles? It doesn't seem right. You know what? I'm going to wait and see if they actually detonate before I tell my boss. And this guy, one guy, Stanislav, what's his name? His boss.
Was it Archipov?
Yeah, he says.
Was it Archipov?
If he had told his boss would have hit the red button. His boss didn't have that kind of discernment. That was why he sat on it. And he had no right to sit on that information. But he saved humanity by doing so. Now imagine it's this heightened level of tension in that exact same situation. Somebody launches the rocket and they think it's a nuke. You could have people underestimate the danger, how quickly a nuclear war could start, even by accident, and how quickly, once it starts, it would absolutely spiral out of control into general war between NATO and Russia and be the end of the world. It's a real danger.
I agree with that. And, you know, you've got Lindsey Graham talking about nuclear first strike, so that makes everything worse. But that's another question that I just don't understand. Actually, I do understand. It's just I don't want to talk about it, but we have to. You've got Trump manipulated by so many voices. He needs new advisors, period. Because whoever is talking to that man is out of control. Like, I don't know what they tell him, but he's completely out of control. So you've got Trump attacking a man like Thomas Massie, person that is only driven by patriotism and is accountable to American people. And he's like rallying and raising money for Lindsey Graham. Like, what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, Marco Rubio is the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor now, right? So, I mean, and as I'm sure you know, we all knew Marco Rubio is about as bad as it gets. He was never a Trotskyite, but he is basically so close with those neoconservatives. He's like John Bolton, right? He was never a leftist, but he is very, very close with that set. And you know, I don't know exactly the full extent of the history of his relationship with the Israel lobby in Florida, but they got his ass for sure. And that's who's telling Trump what's true. I mean, God, I just have minor flashbacks of Rubio's stances on things over the years. You just think about him with McCain and Hillary championing the war for Al Qaeda in Libya and then on to Syria and all of these things. He's been as bad as anyone on virtually everything. And then Trump, he's never read any books. He doesn't even read the journal in the morning, right? He doesn't read anything. You know, and he's probably right not to trust a CIA briefing in the morning, but it makes him essentially a prisoner of all the people who work for him, because he can only make his decisions based on what they tell him. And, you know, I hate Bill Clinton probably more than anyone else on this continent hates Bill Clinton. So I'm not like praising the guy, but I'm just saying his reputation among his staffers was, when you go in to brief Bill Clinton about something, you better have your act together, because he will know more than you about everything. So you better have read your books, and you better not confuse your Sunnis and Shiites and things, because you're going to get run right the hell out of there on a rail. This guy cares enough about doing the job he's trying to do, as evil as that is, that he wants to do a good job of it. Bill and Hillary both kind of A+ front of the class type students. You know what I mean? So you can't just, as evil as they are, again, I'm not giving them credit. You can't just walk into a room and tell Hillary Clinton this, that, and the other thing about the situation in France or Saudi Arabia or whatever, and have her go, oh, okay, if you say so, because she actually does know a thing about this. She does know the people involved. She's known them for years, and she remembers something from last year and 2 years before that. And so there's some real substance there. Donald Trump is essentially, even when he really means well, his instincts are much better than either of the Clintons, that's for sure. But even when he means well, he doesn't have a real foundation to rely on in terms of base knowledge of the situation. So instead, it's like, all right, who wants what? And what's it going to cost? And what difference does it make? And he's very unlikely to get something like a real full briefing in one shot. I'm thinking of famously his story of being convinced to go ahead and recognize Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights. And he says, yeah, I mean, Miriam Adelson gave me all this money. And then David Friedman, and that's not Milton Friedman's son, the economist. This is the other guy who was the ambassador. And then David Friedman, he explained the Golan Heights to me for 5 minutes. And I said, okay, good enough. I hereby recognize Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights. Right? He didn't have in mind any reason why not to do that. You know what I mean? That's going to continue to come up, right? That he's a prisoner of his staff. Right. And even as you put it, right, the last guy who talked to him, not even just what he learned this week or this year, but what he learned today, because even the stuff that he learned last week didn't really take that well. You know what I mean? So Rubio can just is like Ram. Rubio could just write over his instructions every day. Exactly. You know?
Well, that's exactly what I say all the time. Trump came in with good intentions, and you know, you're a product of your environment, right? And look what happened. When he was out, he had a really good direction and really good thoughts of what should be done here to fix this. As soon as he gets in and is in this pack of wolves that just want to mislead him every opportunity they get, all of a sudden Trump's rhetoric changes. And it's not because he's a bad dude or he didn't mean well. It's because he simply doesn't understand anything about foreign policy. He could barely tell the difference between Albania and Armenia. He cannot even remember names. He doesn't know anything about geopolitics. He's a businessman. And what really upsets me, though, is that the first time we risked that, when he was in the White House, we said, you know what, it's fine. He doesn't know. At least he's an outsider. He can clean up the house. He had all these years to start getting to know Scott. Like, there are people like you that he can invite for a brief. Why does not he do that? Why is no one advising for him to say, hey, we actually have someone who knows this area, who knows this situation, who investigated this for like years. Maybe call him. Maybe that's a good idea.
There's two answers to that. The first one is, he's basically just a Rush Limbaugh fan in a golf cart, right? He's not the kind of guy who would host the Rush Limbaugh show. He's the kind of guy who listens to the Rush Limbaugh show and goes, yeah, that's what I think too, right? So it's like, there's nothing particularly special about his political views at all, right? They're, you know, pretty talk radio listener, run of the mill kind of takes on everything. And then the second answer, of course, is the Israel lobby. That's who got to pick Donald Trump's cabinet, same as it was Citigroup that picked Barack Obama's cabinet. It was Miriam Adelson and her minions. And I'm sorry, the name has escaped me off the tip of my tongue. The chief of staff lady that he brought from Florida who ran the campaign.
Right.
And I'm sorry, her name is right on the tip of my tongue, but she was clearly representing Israel's interests here in like the rubber stamp of who gets to join the team or who doesn't. And quite frankly, I don't have the credentials to be anywhere near these people, but there are a lot of good pro-restraint, pro-realist, non-interventionist truth tellers with real credentials from all the fancy universities and former jobs they've held and whatever, who absolutely could be up there advising these people. But they're just not welcome because it ain't America first. It's Israel instead. And until that changes, this is how we're going to be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think Trump is the most pro-Zionist president, I've ever seen. Unfortunately, I really did not expect that, but it is what it is. And before we wrap up, one last question. Talking about Israel, do you think because Trump is under so much influence, and you know really well why, somehow it is beneficial for Israel to keep Russia bogged down with Ukraine, possibly a bigger conflict there, so that they can deal with Iran separately, because that's exactly what they want. They wanted this for the longest time. They even had the plan. What was it, like 5 years in 7 countries in 5 years or something? Like, do you think that plays a big part in Russia-Ukraine conflict as well?
I can't say I've seen too many indications of that. I mean, the way you constructed that does make sense on the face of it, that if Russia's bogged down in Ukraine, they're going to be less effective in what though, right? Because if you look at over the last 25 years, Russia has helped the United States to lean on the Ayatollah to get him to behave and obey and sign the damn thing. I mean, that's why a big part of the reason why the Ayatollah went along with Obama's nuclear deal of 2015 was that Putin called him up and said, listen, I want you to do this. So in other words, why would Russia be a pain for Netanyahu? Because he can restrain the Ayatollah. But if Netanyahu could get Russia bogged down where Putin is too distracted to restrain the Ayatollah, then Netanyahu has an easier pretext for war, for conflict. He doesn't want the Ayatollah restrained. Right? He wants an excuse to bomb him. Although in this case, I don't know, because it's just as true that the Russians and Iranians have been pushed closer together, and they are not historical allies. No. But Russia has been buying drones by the thousands from the Iranians, have become somewhat dependent on them in the war. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but yeah, I guess to a degree. And so their friendship is closer. They don't have a real treaty of alliance or anything like that, but their relationship is closer. So if possibly that serves Israeli interests in the short term, and that's even what they're thinking, and in part of maybe even, like you're saying, American Zionist support for the war in Ukraine as, a cudgel against Russia for that purpose, right. That is still probably ultimately backfire on them, in the end, and cost them much more, because the Russians and Iranians will be closer than ever. And so whatever pressure the Israelis put on America to put on Iran, the Americans are going to have that much more trouble. In fact, just the other day, they announced the JCPOA is finally dead. And why? Because the European powers, after America left the deal, the European powers, after the bombing, the Iranians kicked the inspectors out, and the Europeans said, oh, snap back sanctions because you kicked the inspectors out. And Russia and China quit the treaty and said, that's it. This whole thing is so corrupt. The fact that you guys would try to do the snapback sanctions in these circumstances, forget it. We won't go along. And so now the deal is all the way finally dead, as a consequence of that. So, and honestly, like if you just think of a situation in the world where Israel was just a normal country, where they gave up the West Bank and Gaza Strip to be an independent Palestinian state decades ago, back when they promised Jimmy Carter in the 70s to do so or whatever. And all of this had just been resolved, and we had no terror wars in the Middle East. Just how much more stable the entire planet would be, how much less terrorism there would be, how less bankrupt and morally bankrupt the United States would be. And just, we would be living in such a better world than this one where we have
absolutely. But Scott, that's not their intention. That's not their intention, right? They don't want the better world. They don't make as much money, and they don't consolidate the power in better world. They prefer the conflict, unfortunately. And it's up to us, people, to, I guess, be more stronger in opposition, be more powerful with our voices. That's why they are shutting us down, and that's why they are killing people. But, well, thank you so much for coming. This was very interesting. I knew it would be. You're doing an amazing job, when it gets to foreign policy and America's reaction to it, and pretty much everything that you touched. Thank you so much for coming, and tell my audience where they can find you and where they can buy your books.
Sure. Okay. So I am about to launch the Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom. That is at scotthortonacademy.com. Sign up with your email there, and you'll be the first to know when we go live here in just the next couple of days. Really excited about that. Otherwise, you can find me at the Libertarian Institute. That's libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com, scotthortonshow.com, and amazon.com for my books. Again, that's Fool's Errand on Afghanistan, Enough Already on the Terror Wars, and Provoked. And if you would, please send me your mailing address to my assistant, and I'd love to send you a copy of Provoked. It's how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed this a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.